So glad you're back. You're going to love today's story.
Arthur Vance laughed as he poured the vintage Bordeaux over Elena Thorne's architectural model in front of the entire board of directors. The dark, tannin-heavy liquid pooled in the miniature courtyards she had spent 6 weeks meticulously carving, staining the pale balsa wood a bruised, ugly purple. The scent of fermented grapes and expensive oak filled the sterile air of the boardroom, a sharp contrast to the clinical smell of the blueprints spread across the mahogany table. He didn't stop until the decanter was empty. He set the crystal glass down with a deliberate clack that echoed against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. "It lacked vision anyway, Elena," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that masked a jagged edge of cruelty. "Much like your father, you Thorne types are all the same, obsessed with the foundation while the roof is collapsing." Elena didn't flinch. She stood at the edge of the table, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She could feel the heat of a dozen stares, the board members, men in charcoal suits who smelled of cigars and stagnant power, and Julian Vance, who sat to his father's right. Julian didn't look up from his tablet, his thumb scrolling idly as if the public humiliation of his father's ward was merely background noise to a stock trade. "That model represented 40 hours of structural calculations," she said, her voice steady, devoid of the tremor he clearly wanted to hear. Arthur stepped closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of peppermint and cold ambition. He was a man who had built an empire on the bones of smaller men, and he took a visible, visceral pleasure in the way the wine continued to drip from the model onto the white marble floor. 40 hours of mediocrity," he corrected. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he used a single finger to flick a stray strand of her hair. "You should be thanking me. I'm saving you from the embarrassment of presenting this trash to the investors tomorrow." Across the table, Martha Sterling shifted in her seat. The older woman's knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of her leather portfolio. Her eyes met Elena's for a fraction of a second, a look filled with a terrifying mixture of pity and a warning Elena didn't yet understand. Martha was the only one who ever looked at her with anything resembling humanity, yet even she remained silent under the weight of the Vance name. "Clean it up," Arthur snapped, the mask of the jovial mentor slipping to reveal the tyrant beneath. "And don't bother coming to the gala tonight. You don't have the dress for it, and you certainly don't have the status." He turned his back on her, a dismissal so absolute it felt like a physical blow. The board members began to murmur among themselves, the sound like the buzzing of locusts. Julian finally looked up, offering her a smirk that was more a sneer of pity than a smile. He followed his father toward the double oak doors, the heavy thud of their departure signaling the end of the session. Elena remained in the silent room. The wine had reached the edge of the table and was now pattering onto the floor with a rhythmic, wet sound. She reached into the pocket of her blazer, her fingers brushing against the rough edge of a heavy, wax-sealed envelope Martha had pressed into her hand that morning in the hallway. "Wait until you are alone," Martha had whispered. "The wolf is at the door, Elena. It's time you remembered whose blood is in your veins." She didn't cry. The rage was there, a cold, hard coal in her chest, but it was being smothered by a sudden, sharp clarity. She looked at the ruined model, the glass cage she had designed for the Vance flagship project. It was poetic, really. He thought he was destroying her work, but he was only confirming the prison he'd built for her. She walked to the head of the table, the very seat Arthur had occupied moments ago. The leather was still warm. She pulled the envelope from her pocket and broke the seal. Inside was a single, yellowed photograph and a legal document with a seal that didn't belong to the Vance Corporation. As she scanned the lines of the text, the air in her lungs seemed to sharpen. Her eyes traced the names, the dates, and the staggering numbers that detailed a theft far greater than a few architectural ideas. "You think I don't have the status, Arthur?" she whispered to the empty, opulent room. She looked out at the city, at the Vance towers that dominated the horizon. They were built on a lie, a foundation of stolen legacy and buried truths. She felt the weight of a signet ring tucked into the corner of the envelope, a Thorne family crest, hidden for 20 years. He had called her a weed. He had treated her like a servant in her own kingdom. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had kept memorized but never dared to use. It was a direct line to a forensic firm she knew Arthur feared. "Simon Thorne," she asked when the line clicked open. "This is Elena. I have the records, all of them." She glanced back at the wine-soaked model. The glass cage was broken, and for the first time in her life, Elena Thorne realized she wasn't the one trapped inside. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking a sharp, predatory rhythm against the marble. The countdown had begun. Arthur Vance had exactly 48 hours of perceived power left, and he had no idea that the girl he had just humiliated was the one who held the keys to his empire's destruction. The next morning, the sharp scent of white vinegar filled Elena Thorne's small kitchen as she scrubbed the ghost of a wine stain from her sleeve. Her hands were steady, a stark contrast to the frantic pulse she'd felt in the boardroom only 12 hours earlier. On the scarred wooden table, the Thorne signet ring sat next to her phone. It looked ancient, heavy with a history she was only beginning to untangle. A soft knock at the door preceded Martha Sterling. The older woman slipped inside, her face etched with a worry that seemed decades deep. She didn't say a word at first, simply reaching out to squeeze Elena's hand. Her skin felt like parchment, dry and fragile, yet her grip was firm. "He's looking for the records, Elena," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "Arthur spent the night in the study. He knows something is missing." "He doesn't know I have them," she replied, glancing at the phone. Simon Thorne had already sent the first batch of decrypted files. They weren't just business ledgers. They were a roadmap of how Arthur Vance had systematically dismantled the Thorne family's legacy while pretending to be its savior. "You have to be careful," Martha said, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting a black car to pull up at any moment. "He's already talking about cleaning house." "He mentioned my pension, Elena. He said if I couldn't keep track of the trash in the office, I wasn't fit to manage his home." A cold spark of rage ignited in her chest. It was one thing for him to humiliate her, but threatening the only woman who had provided a shred of maternal warmth in that cold mansion was a bridge too far. She stood up, pulling on her coat. "He won't touch your pension, Martha. I'm going to the estate. I have personal items to retrieve from my old desk." 2 hours later, the heavy, oppressive scent of lilies, Arthur's favorite, a smell that always reminded Elena of a funeral, suffocated the grand foyer of the Vance estate. She hadn't even made it to the stairs before Claire Vance appeared at the top of the landing. Claire was draped in a silk robe that cost more than Elena's car, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed even at this hour. "Still lurking," Claire sneered, descending the stairs with a predatory grace. She stopped 2 steps above Elena, maintaining the height advantage. "I thought my father made it clear that the help was no longer required. Or did you come back for more wine? I hear the vintage he poured on you was quite expensive." Elena didn't flinch. She met the woman's gaze with a level stare that seemed to unsettle Claire. "I'm here for my drafting files, Claire, nothing more." "Oh, please." Claire reached into her pocket and pulled out a wad of crumpled $20 bills. She tossed them into the air, watching them flutter down like dying leaves onto Elena's shoes. "Take it, for the dry cleaning. Consider it a tip for finally knowing your place. Though honestly, you smelled like a bargain bin even before the wine." The disrespect was calculated, a performance for the 2 maids standing in the shadows of the hallway. Elena didn't reach for the money. She simply stepped over the bills, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo against the marble that echoed like a countdown. "Elena!" Arthur Vance's voice boomed from the doorway of his study. He looked tired, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled, but his eyes were as sharp as shards of glass. He held a silver tray with a single document resting on it. "In here." "Now," he commanded. She followed him into the mahogany-lined room. The air here smelled of old paper and expensive scotch. Arthur didn't sit. He slid the tray toward her across his desk. "It's a standard severance agreement," he said, his tone dismissive. "A 6-month cushion, All you have to do is sign the non-disclosure clause. It's for your own protection, really. People in this industry talk. You wouldn't want a reputation for being difficult. Elena glanced at the paper. It wasn't a severance agreement. It was a gag order that would bury her career and legally bind her to silence regarding the financial discrepancies she'd uncovered. "And if I don't sign?" she asked quietly. Arthur leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the desk until it swallowed her. "Then Martha loses her position. Today, no references, no pension. And I'll make sure every firm from here to London knows that Elena Thorne is a thief who was caught red-handed with company secrets." He smirked, leaning back, confident in his victory. He thought he had her cornered. He thought the girl he'd raised in the shadow of his ego was still afraid of the dark. Elena reached into her bag, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the Thorne ring. She pulled out her phone instead and laid it on top of the document. "You're right, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than his shout. "People in this industry do talk. Especially when they find out that the Vance empire was built on a foundation of Thorne blood and forged signatures." The color didn't leave his face yet, but his eyes narrowed into slits. "What are you talking about?" "I think you know," she said, turning toward the door. "The board meeting is in 47 hours. I'd suggest you spend that time looking for a very good lawyer. You're going to need one when Simon Thorne presents the audit." She walked out before he could respond, leaving the document unsigned on the tray. As she passed Claire in the foyer, Elena didn't look at her. She just kept walking, the lion finally out of the cage. The countdown had begun, and for the first time in 20 years, Arthur Vance looked genuinely afraid. The following morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the forensic archive, casting long, skeletal shadows across the mahogany tables. Elena Thorne sat in the silence, the bitter scent of over-extracted espresso clinging to the back of her throat. On the table before her lay the Thorne-Vance merger file from 1998, a document that had been the foundation of a billion-dollar empire and a lie that had lasted 20 years. Simon Thorne moved with a clinical precision that bordered on the ghostly. He didn't speak as he slid a high-resolution scan across the table. Under the ultraviolet light, the ink on the original deed didn't just look old, it looked fractured. "The chemical composition of the blue ink used in your father's signature didn't exist in 1998, Simon said, his voice a low, rhythmic hum. "It's a synthetic polymer developed in 2004. Arthur Vance didn't just steal the land, Elena. He waited until your father was in the ground, then backdated the entire transfer using a forgery so sophisticated it required a master's hand, or a thief's desperation." Elena felt a cold, sharp thrill run down her spine. She reached out, her fingertips grazing the edge of the vellum. The paper felt unnaturally smooth, a tactile reminder of the polish Arthur applied to every one of his crimes. This was the weapon. It wasn't just a rumor or a family secret. It was a forensic death sentence for the Vance legacy. "He thinks I'm bluffing," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the jagged lines of the forged T. "He thinks I'm still the little girl he rescued from the ruins of my own life." "Arrogance is a terminal condition," Simon replied, closing the folder with a definitive snap. "He's already moving to insulate himself. My contacts at the bank say he's trying to accelerate the offshore transfers before the board meeting." "Let him," she said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "The more he moves, the more tracks he leaves." 3 miles away, in the hushed, velvet-lined interior of the Sterling Club, Arthur Vance was not acting like a man under threat. He sat at the center of a circular table, surrounded by 3 of the city's most influential developers. The air was thick with the expensive, woody aroma of his signature cologne and the sharp, metallic click of his gold lighter. "The girl has spirit, I'll give her that," Arthur said, his voice booming with a forced, jovial warmth that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned back, puffing on a cigar that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. "But spirit doesn't hold up in a courtroom. Elena Thorne is a charity case I took in out of the goodness of my heart. Now she thinks she can bite the hand that fed her for 2 decades. Julian Vance sat to his father's right, his face a mask of uneasy silence. He watched as Arthur took a long draw of his scotch, the ice clinking against the crystal with a sound like shattering glass. "Father," Julian started, his voice barely a murmur. "She mentioned Simon Thorne. If there's an audit—" "There will be no audit," Arthur snapped, the joviality vanishing instantly. He slammed his glass onto the table, splashing amber liquid onto the white linen. The table went silent. The other developers looked away, suddenly fascinated by their own appetizers. "I built this city while she was still playing with blocks. I own the land, I own the permits, and by God, I own the narrative. She's a disgruntled employee with a vivid imagination, nothing more." He turned to the waiter, snapping his fingers with a sharp, entitled crack. "Another round, and bring me the phone. I need to make sure the board knows exactly what kind of mental instability our lead architect has been suffering from lately." The rage spike hit Julian then. The casual, practiced way his father began to dismantle a woman's reputation over a midday drink. It was a performance of power, a public branding of Elena as unstable before she could even speak her truth. Back in the quiet of the archives, Elena wasn't listening to the whispers Arthur was sowing. She was looking at a photograph Martha Sterling had tucked into the back of the file. It was a picture of her mother, standing on the very plot of land where the Vance Plaza now stood. Her mother looked happy, her eyes bright with a future that had been stolen before it could begin. Elena pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Is it time?" the voice on the other end asked. It was Martha, her tone trembling with a mix of fear and long-overdue justice. "It's time, Martha," Elena said, her voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "I need the original ledgers from the 1999 estate sale, the ones Arthur told you to burn." "I kept them," Martha whispered. "I kept everything, Elena. I knew one day you'd look at him and finally see the wolf." "I see him," Elena said, looking at her reflection in the darkened window. She didn't recognize the soft, compliant woman she had been 48 hours ago. "And I'm going to make sure the whole world sees him, too." She hung up and looked at the clock. 36 hours until the board meeting. 36 hours until the lion finally cornered the wolf in his own den. She picked up her bag, the weight of the forged deed a comforting anchor against her hip. The countdown was no longer a threat, it was a promise. As she stepped out into the humid afternoon air, the first rumble of thunder rolled across the city. The storm was coming, and for the first time in her life, Elena Thorne wasn't looking for cover. She was the lightning. The following morning, the glass and steel lobby of Vance International felt like a mausoleum. Elena Thorne walked across the polished marble, her heels clicking with a rhythmic finality that she hadn't possessed 28 hours ago. She wasn't here to hide. She was here to observe the wreckage before the collapse. The air in the building was thick with the scent of burnt espresso and the artificial freshness of industrial cleaners, a sharp contrast to the humid, honest storm that had rolled through the city the night before. She found Arthur Vance in the executive lounge, standing before a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city he believed he owned. He was adjusting his silk tie, the deep burgundy color of dried blood, while Julian Vance stood nearby, scrolling through a tablet with a furrowed brow. "Elena," Arthur said, not turning around. He could see her reflection in the glass, a pale ghost in his periphery. "I assumed you'd be at home, packing, or perhaps looking for a lawyer you can actually afford." "I've been doing some research instead," she replied, her voice steady. She moved to the sideboard, pouring herself a glass of water. The pitcher was beaded with cold condensation, the chills seeping into her fingertips. "It's fascinating what one can find in the archives when they know exactly where the bodies are buried." Arthur turned then, his eyes narrowing. He let out a short, dismissive bark of a laugh. "Archives? You always were too poetic for your own good. You think some dusty blueprints or a few late invoices will save you. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. By noon, you'll be a footnote in this company's history." He stepped closer, invading her space. The smell of his sandalwood cologne was suffocating, a heavy, expensive mask for the rot beneath. "You should have taken the settlement I offered. Now you'll leave with nothing but the clothes on your back and that pathetic Thorne name." The Thorn name has a much longer history than your empire, Arthur, Elena said, her gaze never wavering. Are you absolutely certain the 1999 estate files were destroyed? Fire is a fickle thing. Sometimes the truth is fireproof. The silence that followed was heavy. Julian looked up from his tablet, his eyes darting between his father and Elena. He saw the way Arthur's jaw tightened, a microscopic tremor in his hand that he quickly hid by shoving it into his pocket. It was the first time Julian had seen his father look even remotely unsettled. Martha has been filling your head with ghost stories, Arthur sneered, though the vitriol felt forced. That woman is senile. I pay for her silence with a pension she doesn't deserve. If you're pinning your hopes on the ramblings of a maid, you're more desperate than I thought. I'm not pinning my hopes on anything, she said, setting the glass down with a sharp clack against the marble. I'm pinning them on facts. You should check the vault, Arthur, just to be sure. She turned to leave, catching Simon Thorne standing by the glass doors. He didn't say a word, but the slight nod he gave her was enough. He had the digital backup secured. The trap was set. As she walked toward the elevator, Julian caught up to her. Elena, wait. She stopped, watching him. Julian looked exhausted, the gilded cage of his father's expectations finally starting to chafe. He's going to destroy you tomorrow, Julian whispered. He has Claire Vance and the rest of the board in his pocket. Whatever you think you have, it won't be enough. Then you have a choice to make, Julian, she said softly. You can stand on the deck of a sinking ship because you like the uniform, or you can jump before the whirlpool pulls you under. Ask him about the estate sale. Ask him why he's so afraid of a year that ended 2 decades ago. She stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut on Julian's conflicted face. Back in her small apartment, the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, orange shadows across the floor. Elena sat at her desk, the original ledger from Martha Sterling laid open before her. The ink was faded, but the signatures were unmistakable. Simon had already verified the forensic trail. Every penny Arthur had used to launch Vance International had been stolen from her mother's estate, the royal inheritance he had rebranded as his own genius. She checked the clock. 14 hours. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had memorized. Simon, it's time. Send the anonymous pre-read to Claire Vance, just the first 3 pages of the ledger. Let her spend the night wondering how much more we have. Elena hung up and looked out at the city lights. The countdown was almost over. Tomorrow, the lion wouldn't just corner the wolf. She would strip him of his skin in front of everyone he had ever lied to. She felt a cold, sharp sense of peace. The storm hadn't passed. It was simply gathering its strength for the final strike. The evening of the Vance Thanksgiving gala arrived with a chilling, silent precision. The sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city was a fortress of glass and limestone, glowing like a pyre against the darkening November sky. Elena Thorne stepped out of the car, the crisp air biting at her skin, though she barely felt the cold. She wore a dress of midnight silk, simple and architectural, a stark contrast to the heavy, gilded opulence of the foyer. The scent of wood smoke and expensive bourbon hung in the air, mingled with the cloying fragrance of white lilies that lined the grand staircase. She moved through the crowd of high society vultures with a calm that bordered on the predatory. In her clutch, tucked behind her phone, was a small, silver flash drive, the digital ghost of the ledger that Arthur Vance thought he had buried decades ago. Arthur Vance stood at the center of the great room, holding court beneath a chandelier that cost more than the average worker's annual salary. He looked every bit the lion in winter, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his tailored suit straining slightly against the ego that inflated his chest. He was laughing, a booming, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes, as he regaled a group of investors with the story of his self-made rise to power. "It's about vision," Arthur said, his voice carrying over the low hum of a cello quartet playing in the corner. "Most people see a patch of dirt. I saw an empire. I took nothing and turned it into Vance International. That's the difference between a leader and a follower." Elena watched him from the periphery, her pulse a steady, rhythmic thrum. She noticed Claire Vance standing a few feet away from her husband. The woman was a ghost of her usual self. Her hand trembled as she lifted a crystal flute of champagne to her lips, her eyes darting toward Arthur with a mixture of dawning horror and profound confusion. The pre-read Simon had sent the night before was clearly doing its work. Claire looked like a woman who had just realized the foundation of her house was built on a graveyard. "You look like you're planning a coup," a voice murmured beside her. Elena didn't turn to see Julian Vance. She didn't need to. The scent of his expensive, earthy cologne was enough. "Just observing the architecture, Julian. Your father always did have a flair for the dramatic." Julian followed her gaze to Arthur. There was a new shadow in Julian's expression, a flicker of the same doubt that was currently consuming Claire. "He's in rare form tonight. He thinks the new merger is a done deal. He's already talking about the Vance legacy as if it's etched in stone." "Stone can be crushed into sand," Elena said softly. Julian looked at her then, his brow furrowed. "Elena, my mother is acting strange. She's been locked in her room all day, and when she came out, she wouldn't even look at my father. Do you know something?" "I know that the truth has a way of making people uncomfortable," she replied, her voice as smooth as the silk against her legs. "Enjoy the party, Julian. It's going to be a memorable one." She walked away before he could press her further, heading toward the dining hall where the staff was finalizing the seating. The room was a masterpiece of performative gratitude. Long tables were draped in damask, laden with silver tureens and crystal decanters. The smell of roasted rosemary and sage wafted from the kitchen, a domestic scent that felt grotesquely out of place in a house fueled by theft. As the guests began to take their seats, Arthur took his place at the head of the main table. He gestured for Elena to sit near the foot of the table, a calculated move to remind her of her place in his hierarchy. Martha Sterling sat to Elena's left, her face a mask of dignified sorrow. She reached under the table and squeezed Elena's hand, her fingers cold but firm. Arthur tapped his spoon against his glass, the sharp ring silencing the room. "Before we begin this feast," Arthur began, standing tall, "I want to speak about family. Not just the family born of blood, but the family born of shared success. This year, Vance International reaches its zenith, and I owe it all to the grit and determination I learned from my own father, a man who had nothing but gave me the drive to be everything." Elena felt a surge of pure, white-hot rage. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He was standing on the bones of her mother's inheritance, using her royal lineage to season his own fictional backstory. She looked at Claire, who was staring at her plate, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin. "And of course," Arthur continued, his gaze landing on Elena with a patronizing smirk, "we have those who join us along the way. Elena, dear, you've done well for yourself. It's a shame your mother couldn't see you now. She was a woman of modest means, but I like to think I've provided the structure you lacked." A few of the guests chuckled, the sycophants who knew which side their bread was buttered on. The insult was pointed, a public reminder that he considered her a charity case. "My mother had everything she needed, Arthur," Elena said, her voice cutting through the laughter like a blade. "She just didn't realize there were wolves in the garden." Arthur's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before his mask of arrogance reset. "A poet as well as an architect, how charming. But let's not dwell on the past when the future is so bright. Tonight we celebrate the Vance name." He raised his glass, his eyes gleaming with the triumph of a man who thought he had won. "To the legacy we've built, to the empire that will never fall." "To the truth," Elena corrected quietly, though only those closest to her heard. She glanced at her watch. Simon would be in position now. The servers began to move around the table, but the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt heavy, charged with the static of an approaching storm. Claire Vance suddenly stood up, her chair screeching against the marble floor. "Arthur," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "We need to talk, now." "Not now, Claire," Arthur snapped, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "We have guests. Sit down." "I saw the ledger," Claire said, louder this time. The table went dead silent. The sound of a dropped fork echoed like a gunshot. Arthur's face didn't pale, it turned a dark, mottled red. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. I don't know what delusions you're indulging in, but you will sit down and finish this dinner. Elena stood up then, the movement slow and deliberate. Every eye in the room turned to her. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her hand, the culmination of years of silence and months of meticulous planning. She looked at Arthur, really looked at him, and saw not a lion, but a frightened, aging thief. "The dinner is over, Arthur," Elena said, her voice projecting to the back of the hall with effortless authority. "But the show is just beginning." She turned toward the large projection screen at the end of the hall, usually reserved for vanity reels of Vance properties. She nodded to Simon, who was invisible but omnipresent in the house's digital veins. The lights in the great room dimmed automatically. Arthur let out a guttural snarl of confusion, but before he could shout for security, the screen flickered to life. It wasn't a picture of a skyscraper or a luxury resort. It was a high-resolution scan of a handwritten ledger, the Sterling family seal embossed at the top, and Arthur's own signature scrawled beneath a confession of debt he had never intended to pay. The countdown had hit 0. The wolf was no longer at the door. The lion was already inside the den, and she had brought the light. The silence in the great room was so absolute it felt physical, a heavy weight pressing against the lungs of every socialite and mogul in attendance. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the cooling fans inside the massive projector. Elena stood at the edge of the light, her silhouette sharp and unwavering against the backdrop of Arthur's ruin. She watched the blue light of the screen reflect in his eyes, turning his shock into something cold and spectral. Arthur Vance didn't move for a long 10 seconds. Then, his hand began to shake. The ruddy, arrogant color drained from his jowls, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray that looked like wet parchment. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, bulged and darted frantically across the room, searching for an escape or a lie that would hold water, but finding only the stony faces of his peers. His lower lip began a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor, and the glass of scotch in his hand tilted precariously, the ice clinking against the crystal with a frantic, metallic rattle. He looked suddenly, pathetically small, the tailored seams of his expensive suit unable to hide the way his spine seemed to liquefy under the weight of the signature displayed for all to see. "That's a fabrication," he finally croaked, his voice cracking like dry timber. He looked around the room, pleading for a single nodding head. "Julian, tell them, this is a digital trick, a gutter rat's revenge." Julian Vance didn't speak. He stepped back, his face pale, his gaze fixed on the ledger on the screen. He looked at his father as if seeing a stranger or perhaps finally seeing the man behind the myth. Beside him, Claire Vance let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hand flying to her throat as she realized the social standing she had spent her life cultivating was evaporating in the glow of a projector bulb. "It's no trick, Arthur," Elena said, her voice a calm, lethal blade that cut through his frantic bluster. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The room belonged to her now. "Simon has spent the last 3 hours verifying the blockchain trail. That debt didn't just exist. It was sold. 3 weeks ago, a holding company called ET Assets purchased every cent of your outstanding liabilities, including the liens on this very estate." She stepped into the light, the silk of her dress rustling like a warning. Martha Sterling stood near the foyer, her back straighter than it had been in decades, her eyes shining with a fierce, quiet pride that needed no words. She had carried the secret of the Sterling bloodline like a burden. Now she watched Elena Thorne wield it like a scepter. "You called me a charity case for 20 years, Elena continued, walking toward him with the measured grace of a predator who had already won. "You told me I was lucky to eat at your table, but the truth is, you've been eating at mine." Arthur tried to lunge forward, a desperate, clumsy movement, but Simon Thorne stepped out from the shadows near the tech booth. Simon didn't need to use force. His mere presence, solid and backed by the authority of the evidence he held, was enough to make Arthur stumble back into his leather chair. The chair he thought was his. The guests began to murmur, a rising tide of judgment. One of the board members, a man who had laughed at Arthur's jokes for years, pointedly turned his back, whispering something to his wife. The social circle was closing, and the man who had once been its center was now a pariah. Elena stopped inches from him. The scent of his expensive cologne was now masked by the sour smell of cold sweat. She leaned down, her voice a whisper meant only for him, though the silence of the room carried it to every ear. "I'm not here to negotiate, and I'm not here to argue." She placed a single, heavy card on the table in front of him, the black and gold key card to the Vance corporate offices. "I've already frozen the accounts. Security is waiting at the gates to escort you to a hotel, a modest one." She turned to the room, her gaze sweeping over the witnesses who had once looked down on her. "The party is over. Please exit through the front. The staff will be staying. They work for me now." With a final, lingering look at the man who had stolen her childhood, she didn't wait for his response. She turned and walked toward the grand staircase, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence on the marble. She didn't look back at the wreckage. She had brought the light, and in its glow, the wolf was finally exposed as nothing more than a thief in a borrowed suit. The silence that followed her departure from the table was heavy, thick with the scent of expensive cigars, and the sudden, sharp ozone of the projector still humming in the corner. Arthur Vance didn't move for several seconds. He sat at the head of the mahogany table, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly the knuckles looked like bleached bone. The power he had wielded for decades seemed to evaporate in the space between heartbeats, replaced by a cold, clinical vacuum. He finally found his voice, though it was thin and jagged, a shadow of his usual baritone. "This is a fabrication," he hissed, his eyes scanning the room, searching for a single friendly face. "A desperate, pathetic play by a girl who doesn't understand the world she's trying to burn down. Julian, call security. Have her arrested for trespassing and fraud." Julian Vance didn't move. He stood near the window, his gaze fixed on the documents Elena had left behind. He looked at his father, and for the first time in his life, the admiration was gone, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. "The accounts are frozen, Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I just checked the internal portal on my phone. Access denied. All of it." The color began to leave Arthur's face in a terrifying, visible tide. It was a study in geological erosion. The high, sharp cheekbones that usually broadcasted his superiority seemed to sink into his skull, and the ruddy, self-assured glow of a man who owned the horizon drained away, leaving behind a gray, waxy pallor. His lower lip trembled, a frantic, rhythmic twitch that he couldn't suppress, while his eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal searching for a hole in the wainscoting. The sweat began to bead at his hairline, thick and oily, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers as he struggled to draw a breath that didn't rattle in his chest. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man watching his own execution in a high-definition mirror. "It's a glitch," he gasped, his hand flying to his silk tie, loosening it with trembling fingers. "A temporary technical error. Martha, tell them this is impossible." Martha Sterling stood at the far end of the table, her expression unreadable. She didn't offer a word of comfort. Instead, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a leather-bound folder, sliding it across the polished wood toward the center of the room. "I've been the executor of the Thorne Estate's dormant clauses for 24 years, Arthur. I was waiting for the bloodline to manifest. Elena didn't just stumble into this. She earned it." The room seemed to shrink around him. Two men in dark, charcoal suits entered the room, not the house security Arthur had paid for years, but a private detail led by Simon Thorne. The forensic investigator walked with a measured, predatory grace, stopping just behind Arthur's chair. He didn't touch the man, but the proximity alone was an indictment. "Mr. Vance," Simon said, his voice echoing the cold finality of a closing vault. "I am here on behalf of the Thorne Estate and the Federal Oversight Committee. We have the warrants for the seizure of all digital assets and physical records within this residence and the corporate headquarters." "You can't do this," he barked, though the sound lacked any real bite. He tried to stand, but his legs seemed to fail him and he slumped back into the leather chair. I built this. I took a dying name and made it a kingdom. You built a monument to a theft, Simon replied. He nodded to the guards. Please escort the former CEO to the foyer. He is permitted one personal bag, which will be inspected before departure. The witnesses, the board members who had laughed at Arthur's cruel jokes for years, the socialites who had clamored for his invitations, began to move. They didn't move toward him to offer help. They moved away, creating a wide, literal circle of isolation. Claire Vance watched from the doorway, her face pale, her hand covering her mouth as she realized the lifestyle she had used to belittle Elena was dissolving into smoke. He looked at Julian, a final, desperate plea in his eyes. Son, do something. This is your inheritance. Julian looked at the blackened gold keycard sitting on the table, then back at the broken man in the chair. It was never mine, Dad. It was hers. It was always hers. He turned his back, walking toward the terrace to avoid watching the final collapse. The guards stepped forward, their movements synchronized and professional. They gripped Arthur by the elbows, lifting him from the seat he had occupied as a throne. He didn't fight them. The fight had been drained out of him the moment the room turned silent. As they led him toward the grand staircase, his heels dragged slightly on the marble, a dull, scraping sound that replaced the confident stride he had used to intimidate his rivals. He passed the portraits of the men he had claimed as his ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to judge him as a squatter. In the foyer, the staff he had treated like furniture stood in a line, watching in a silence that was more damning than any shout. He reached the heavy oak doors, the cool night air hitting his face, smelling of rain and damp earth. Outside, a single, unassuming black sedan waited. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, just the quiet, methodical removal of a man who no longer existed in the world of the elite. As the door clicked shut behind him, the lights of the Vance estate, now the Thorne estate, begun to dim, one by one, until the house stood as a dark silhouette against the rising moon, finally purged of the man who had tried to steal its soul. 3 months had passed since the name Vance was stripped from the marble gates of the estate like a stubborn stain. The transition had been surgical, a quiet restructuring of reality that left the city's elite whispering in hushed tones behind their crystal flutes. For Elena Thorne, the time jump felt less like a leap and more like a slow, deep breath after a lifetime of drowning. She stood in her new office on the 42nd floor of the Thorne Tower, the glass walls offering a panoramic view of the skyline she was currently redesigning. The scent of fresh blueprints, that sharp, metallic tang of ink and high-end vellum, filled the room, a sensory anchor that grounded her in the present. She ran a finger over the embossed logo on her desk, Thorne Architectural Holdings. It was no longer a dream or a hidden file on a burner phone. It was the floor beneath her feet. Simon Thorne entered without knocking, his footsteps muffled by the thick charcoal carpet. He looked younger, the exhaustion of the decade-long investigation finally replaced by a quiet, steady purpose. He placed a leather-bound folder on her desk, his expression unreadable. "The final audit is complete, Elena," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Every shell company, every offshore account Arthur Vance used to bleed your mother's legacy dry has been liquidated. The Thorne Foundation is fully funded." Elena didn't look at the numbers. She looked out at the city. "And Julian?" "He's downstairs," Simon replied. "He said he wanted to see you before he left for the coast." When Julian Vance walked in minutes later, the change in him was visceral. The expensive, tailored suits were gone, replaced by a simple navy sweater and jeans. The arrogance that had once defined the Vance bloodline had been replaced by a weary, honest humility. He didn't sit. He stood by the window, looking out at the world he no longer owned. "He's living in a studio apartment in the Heights, Elena," Julian said, his voice cracking slightly. He didn't need to name the man they were both thinking of. "It's above a laundromat. The smell of cheap detergent and damp concrete is constant. I went to see him yesterday." Elena felt a cold prickle of curiosity. "Did he speak?" Julian shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips. "He tried to demand I bring him his favorite scotch. He actually snapped his fingers at me as if I could conjure a butler out of thin air. When I told him the accounts were frozen and the wine cellar had been auctioned off to pay the back taxes, he just collapsed. Not physically, but inside. His skin, once taut with the arrogance of a man who owned the horizon, now hung loose and gray. He's mapped with the fine, frantic lines of someone who has finally realized the world doesn't owe him a second glance. The image of Arthur Vance, the man who had treated her like an architectural error, huddled in a damp room while the rhythmic thumping of industrial washers shook his floorboards, provided a surge of visceral satisfaction. It wasn't just that he was poor, it was that he was irrelevant. Martha Sterling is staying at the estate, Julian continued, turning to face her. She's turned your mother's old solarium into a community garden. She says the soil is finally healthy again. She deserves the peace, Elena said softly. We all do, Julian replied. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. He asked about you, at the very end. He wanted to know if you were happy. Elena turned away from the window, her gaze landing on a framed photograph on her shelf, the only one she had of her mother, retrieved from a hidden safe Simon had uncovered. Tell him I'm not happy, Julian. Tell him I'm free. There's a difference. As Julian left, the silence of the office felt heavier. This was the cost of justice. She had the empire, the name, and the truth, but the family she had grown up with was a graveyard of lies. She had traded the comfort of a gilded cage for the cold, sharp air of the mountain top. A soft chime on her desk interrupted her thoughts. It was a secure line. Simon Thorne had mentioned one final piece of the puzzle that hadn't been quite solved, a series of transactions leading to a name they hadn't yet identified, someone who had helped Arthur Vance coordinate the original theft of her mother's identity. Elena picked up the phone, her pulse quickening. The victory was won, but the Thorne legacy required absolute purity. Yes, she said, her voice like ice. Elena, a voice whispered on the other end, one she didn't recognize yet felt hauntingly familiar. You think it's over because the old man is in the gutter, but Arthur was never the architect, he was just the contractor. Elena gripped the edge of her desk, the cold glass biting into her palm. The shadows of the past weren't gone, they were just shifting. She looked back at her mother's photo, realizing the new normal was only the beginning of a much deeper haunting.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.